Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, AP Stats. Welcome back. So today we're going to cover a couple of topics in Chapter 9 that I purposely left off the last test. I will admit these are this is a challenging topic and can be very, very confusing. So I kind of just wanted to devote some time just to these ideas on their own. And we'll take a couple of days on this, and we're probably going to have a short quiz on this topic in a few days. I'll let you know more about it a little bit. But today we're going to talk about something called a type 1 error and a type 2 error. And we are going to give some consequences of each error in a particular setting. All right, we'll talk about the idea of power on Monday. All right, so when we draw a conclusion from a significance test, we hope our conclusion will be correct. But sometimes we make the wrong conclusion. So these are two types of errors, two things that can occur. A type 1 error occurs if a test rejects the null hypothesis when the null is actually true. In other words, the test finds convincing evidence for the alternative when the alternative really isn't true. A type 2 error occurs if a test fails to reject the null when the alternative is true. And in other words, we do not find convincing evidence for the alternative when we really should have. Okay, so again, very confusing because the whole idea of rejecting and fail to reject, and now we're saying, well, we shouldn't have failed to reject, or we should have supported the HA when we shouldn't have. So there's a lot going on here. So I'm going to give you guys some real life examples here and some jokes, and we're going to try to figure this out. This is a really, really cool table to copy down in your notes. So if you need to pause the video, I would highly recommend you go do so. But here we have all the different scenarios here where we reject the null when the null is true. That's a type 1 error. That would be this area right in here. Oops, sorry, I'll go back. So you reject the null when the null is true. That's a type 1 error. Then you've got the other important instance that we're talking about today. You fail to reject the null when the alternative is true. And that's a type 2 error. All right, so here we have a joke about two movies. So let's set it up like this. Remember that H naught is typically you are innocent, and HA is typically that you are guilty. All right, so in this scenario, a type 1 error would be we reject someone's innocence, we reject H naught, and we have support that they are guilty. Whoops, sorry, misspelled guilty. We reject that they're innocent, and we have support for their guilt. But this is incorrect. We really should not have done that. That's a type 1 error. On the flip side, we have, didn't mean to erase all that, but let me write it again. H naught, remember you're innocent. That's how it works in our criminal justice system. HA is guilty. So on the flip side, you, for a type 2 error, will fail to reject someone's innocence. So in other words, you should have rejected that they were innocent and concluded they were guilty, but you failed to reject that. So now you are, you're stuck in that null territory, and you have no support for the guilt, no support for HA. That's a type 2 error. All right, and that's what this little joke here tries to illustrate. All right, here's another example. H naught. Okay, most people, I would say the null is that you're not pregnant, right? Most of the population's not pregnant. That's our null. Our HA is that you are pregnant. All right, so in a type 1 error, you are rejecting the null. You're rejecting HO when you should not have. And you are supporting the alternative. There's support for pregnancy, and you're rejecting that they're not pregnant, right? So in this meme here, in this little joke, Doctor's telling the older man, you're pregnant, right? And obviously he's not. That's a type 1 error. Okay? Now, the type 2 error, again, you fail to reject HO. Let me go ahead and erase that. You fail to reject. I apologize for this really sloppy writing. I have a really poor stylus, but for the type 2 error, you fail to reject that someone is not pregnant, and you have no support for HA, which is that they are pregnant. Okay? So like I said, it's a very confusing topic. Here there's a lot of double negatives you have to worry about, but pause it and just really think through it, and I think these are very helpful in helping you understand what a type 1 error is versus a type 2 error. All right, so here is just another way to think about type 1 and type 2 errors. The null hypothesis is true, but we mistakenly reject it. The null hypothesis is false, but we fail to reject it. Type 1 versus type 2. Very important. All right, so let's try this example out. So a local high school makes a change that should improve student parking. Before the change, 37% of the school's students approved of the parking that was provided. After the change, the principal surveys an SRS of 200 students at the school. In all, 83 say they approve of the new parking arrangement. The principal cites this as evidence that the change was effective. Describe a type 1 error and a type 2 error in this setting and explain the consequences of each. Okay, so before we look at the solution, I'm just going to briefly write our null hypothesis here. So it sounds like our H naught in this scenario is a true proportion of the students that are satisfied with the parking situation being at about P is equal to 0.37. And then we've got an alternative that says P is greater than 0.37. There's an improvement in students that are satisfied with the parking situation. All right, so keep in mind, a type 1 means you would reject HO when you really shouldn't have, and you support HA. Okay, but this is not the correct conclusion to make. Okay, and on the flip side, the type 1 error would be, sorry, type 2. Let me go ahead and erase all that. So our type 2 would be, we would fail to reject HO, and we did not find support, so there's no support for HA, even though we should have supported HA. We should have rejected this, we failed to reject it, we should have supported HA, but we did not. That's a type 2 error. Okay, so sorry about that awkward cut, but here we have our solution for that previous problem. So let me just go ahead and write out our null again. Here's the null hypothesis. Here is the alternative. Just keep that in mind as you're doing this. It's helpful. Kind of refer back to it so you can easily identify which is which. So in a type 1 error, we find convincing evidence for HA. So there's support for HA. Right? There's definitely support for it. That more than 37% of students were satisfied with the new parking arrangement, when in actuality, the null was true. So we rejected the null when it was actually true, and we supported the alternative when that was actually false. Okay? And a type 2 error, we failed to find convincing evidence, so no support for HA. There's no support for HA. When in reality, you should have supported HA. So you failed to reject the null when you should have rejected the null. All right, and the consequence here, principal takes further action on parking because he thinks it's still a problem when none is needed. All right, so like I said, you might have to pause the slide, really think about that because it is a confusing topic. It's real easy to get mixed up with what you're saying. So be very careful with that. All right, here's another problem. It says in a previous example, we discussed a police department that wants to determine if it is worth the cost to install a speed sensor and traffic camera on the highway near the city. The department will install the speed sensor and traffic camera if more than 20% of the cars on this highway are speeding. The police will select a random sample of 100 cars on the highway and then perform a test at the alpha equals 0.05 significance level of this H naught and this H sub A, where P is a true proportion of all cars on this highway that are speeding. Describe a type 1 error and a type 2 error in this setting and explain the consequences of each. All right, so pause the slide, try it out, and check back once you're finished. Okay, so again, I'm going to write the null here. I'll write our null hypothesis of 20% here, P equals 0.20, and our H sub A of P is greater than 0.20. All right, so for your type 1 error, the police department finds convincing evidence. They find convincing evidence for HA. Right, they're saying, there are more than 20% of the cars on this highway that are speeding, when in reality, that's not true. Right? They rejected this null. There was a rejection of that null hypothesis that should not have happened. Okay? So our consequence is that the police department installs a speed sensor and traffic camera on the highway when it isn't needed, and that's a waste of money. Okay? Now, the type 2 error, the police department does not find convincing evidence that more than 20% of the cars on the highway are speeding when the true proportion is actually greater than 0.20. So they find evidence that, or they just failed to reject the null. There was evidence that more than 20% of the cars are speeding. So in this case, the police department does not install the speed sensor and traffic camera on the highway when it should have. People continue to speed on the highway, putting their safety and that of others at risk. So, sometimes one error is more dangerous than the other. It just depends on the scenario. Here, I would maybe say the type 2 error is probably more egregious just because, you're putting lives at risk. At type 1 error, you're just wasting money. But here, the type 2 error is a little more serious because you're putting lives and safety at risk. Okay, let's try one last problem here. And in this scenario, a drug manufacturer claims that less than 10% of patients who take its new drug for treating Alzheimer's will experience nausea. To test this claim, researchers conduct an experiment. They give the new drug to a random sample of 300 Alzheimer's patients that agree to participate in the study, and all 25 of the subjects experience nausea. Describe a type 1 error and a type 2 error in this setting and explain the consequences of each. All right, so pause the video and try it out and check back in a couple minutes to see how you did. Okay, so here, let me go ahead and write out our null hypothesis and our alternative. So H naught is P is equal to 0.10. Our alternative, H sub A, P is less than 0.10. Always helpful to write this out and refer back to it. All right, now, type 1 error, we find convincing evidence that less than 10% of the Alzheimer's patients experience nausea. We have support for HA. So it means we rejected the null when we should have. So that means the new drug may probably get approved as a consequence, and more patients use it when it doesn't necessarily decrease nausea, when it's not effective, and they use it anyway. Okay? These consequences are a little open-ended. You may, there's not one correct answer. You may add as much or as little as you see, as you deem necessary. All right, the type 2 error, you failed to reject the null when you really should have. In other words, you failed to find convincing evidence that this drug is working. Less than 10% of these patients are experiencing nausea when taking this drug. Consequence of that might mean that the drug is maybe not even approved, deemed not effective. And it may be used on fewer patients, though it does decrease nausea. So patients may be missing out on an effective new drug because your conclusion was incorrect. All right, let me know if you guys have any questions. give me a message on Schoology, email, or Google Classroom.